I'm Hallowell. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over the police officers to Mr. Entertainment.
So, around Pen Deck, what can you tell us about Mike Hallowell then? Well, Mike Hallowell is a personal hero of mine. He is a very great man who has done very many great and heroic deeds. Such as what? Well, the last great and heroic deed he did was to slap Graham Norton around the face with a sock full of diarrhea. And if anyone needs slapping around the face with a sock full of diarrhea, it's Graham Norton. Now that's heroics.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Hallowell.
The first thing I want to say is that the intro that we had began last night, you know, the musical intro that they did. First 30 seconds I thought, oh, I don't know if this is working for me. But then I sort of got into it, and when it finished I was like disappointed it stopped. I thought it was superb actually, so I don't know if anybody else has done this before. I came here today, but if I have, I apologise in advance. Could I just ask you to give a round of applause for all those who were involved in that musical intro last night, which I think was absolutely superb. Thank you. There is a difference between men and women. I figured this out. I've been married 33 years. I sort of just got there. And it's to do with like phone calls. You know, I've noticed that those blokes in the audience, right, who've been fortunate enough to have a spouse, you notice they make phone calls and say things like, "Hello Ethel, it's just me. I'm just ringing to see how you are, pet." And blokes don't do that. They sort of go through the niceties of asking, but it's not really what it's all about. Hence, you have a hypothetical conversation between John Downs and I, where he says, "Is it right that you lost an arm and a leg in an accident the other day, mate?" Yeah. "How are you?" "Well, not too bad, you know, drifting out of consciousness, still in the intensive care ward. Lost no blood. Taking the book apart from that. Anyway, mate, the real reason I'm ringing, just can you still do that blog for this afternoon on Geordie cryptid elephants?" "Yeah, no problem." That's where it goes, because those blokes will get on business. Not a sexist statement, it's just like an observation. Anyway, hence it was in the merry month of August 2010, a good colleague of mine, close personal friend, John Triplow, rang me up and went through the niceties, you know, "How are you? Fine. You? Yeah, great, mate." He said, "I just thought I'd ask you if the top of your head, have you heard about this giant horse-headed creature thing in the Philippines?" And I said, No. "I'll find out. I'll get the nurse to bring the phone to the bedside, make a couple of calls. Give us half an hour, and I'll get back to you." And he said, "I have a vested interest in Filipino cryptids. First reason is another good friend of mine, contrary to popular opinion, I do have more than one, Richard Freeman, he wrote an article for Paranormal magazine on Filipino cryptids recently. It's quite good actually. The second reason is I actually have a daughter-in-law who's a Filipino, or Filipina, I think. So I've got like this hub, like this portal into the Filipino world where I want to like do research. And between my son and my daughter-in-law, right, they can sort of access all these weird stories from me. It's fantastic. So I gave up a Simon a ring and I said, "Has Josie heard of any of these like horse-headed Filipino monsters?" You know, anyway, I don't know. You know, I mean, he's used to me asking this sort of like bizarre question, you know, I mean, he's sort of like inoculated against me, you know. And he said, "I'll go to John, I'll find out." You know, he said, "Dad," he said, "listen, not only have I found out some stuff, but," he said, "I've actually found somebody who's seen it, the Capri, this legendary Filipino monster. I've got his telephone number, he's quite happy for you to give him a message of the results." So apart from this privilege that Richie and I have have for writing for Paranormal magazine. And straight away, I'm going to interrupt myself and say, I know there's people out there who say, listen to that, Ethel. Privilege, writing for Paranormal. He's only saying that because he knows that the editor, Richard Holland, is in the audience. And that's just an unashamed, unabashed attempt to curry favour with the man. Well, yeah, it is. I mean, he pays me money to write articles for him, so, you know, I'm quite happy to make unashamed, unabashed attempts to curry favour with him. I mean, as Ronan Cochrane might have once said, well, probably didn't, you know, he's thinking of Egypt. So anyway, having got the preliminaries out of the way, maybe pitch to Richard for future articles, I might say. Let's get out of business. The Capri. Now, my daughter-in-law, she actually lived in an area of the Philippines called Mindanao, which is sort of one of the eastmost islands in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines are amazing, right? Because they're just filled, teeming with these bizarre cryptids. Some people might say they're so bizarre you can't really call them a cryptid, they're all sorts of elemental. I'm not so sure I can actually draw a line, to be quite frank. I just see them as all one the same, they're just strange creatures. So, the first sort of story that I will give you in a second is about an encounter with the Capri. This is a serious encounter, right? I'm not joking, this is deadly serious. But what I'm going to do is actually, you know, yesterday it was Matthew Williams, he said, I've got an exclusive for you before his talk. This is an exclusive. This is a picture, I'm going to show you in a minute, of two Capris that were filmed, photographed. For the first time ever, this picture is going to be shown. And it's a bit scary, so I prefer if the kids just stay where they are while the adults leave the room. Because you might find it a little bit too much. Here we go. There it is. You can sort of feel the aura of menace radiating from it.
Is that a UFO in the background?
I don't know actually. No, I tell you what it is. It's something that I put there just to make the picture look a bit spooky. Yeah, it was just.
Oh, it looks that way with the two faces.
Yeah. Well, they are a bit scary, aren't they? Do you know what I mean?
I wouldn't like to meet them in the
No.
dark.
I mean, personally, I think it's uncanny that they look like John and I put them in. I told John about it, it's his first weekend. He says to me, he said, you're going to embarrass me. And I said, it's a weird weekend, you know, that's a time for spiritual contemplation, devotion, you know, high-minded stuff. This is going to embarrass you. Yeah, I got caught out the first weird weekend when Richie Freeman done that to me. Never mind. Anyway, here's Mindanao. A second, hopefully.
Very dark place.
Why isn't this loading up? This always happens to me. Okay, this is Mindanao at night. Oh, somebody's trying to help me out here remotely. There we go, thank you. This is Mindanao. Like a lot of the Philippines, it's very forested, right? This is dense, sort of largely uncharted bits of forestry and stuff, where a lot of these cryptids allegedly live. And I have to sort of nail me colours firmly to the mast here and say that I do actually believe in them. Right? I think a lot of these things do exist. I don't understand their nature, and they're very bizarre. But I think a reluctance to believe in them, some of the more orthodox colleagues, is probably, I have to say, down maybe a little bit collective narrow-mindedness on our part as opposed to, you know, a willingness to believe in these things, because there's been so many witnesses to some of these bizarre cryptids. And this one, the giant cigar-smoking Capri of the Philippines is one of them. It's just where the Cornwall bit comes in, right? Down to that later. Yeah. Thank you very much. There we go. The Chocolate Hills, very picturesque part of the Philippines. And you can actually, you see these little hills, they're also small and perfectly formed, and they're sort of, they do look a bit like chocolates in a box, you know, from certain perspectives. Very interesting. This is one of the stomping grounds, apparently, of the Capri. And here's a photograph of some of my daughter all his relatives. The chocolate hills are in the background. They'd be on some sort of day trip there. And the Filipino people just accept the existence of these things without question. Even, you know, I mean, you maybe think that sort of highly educated, professional people may be a little bit more sceptical, a little bit more cynical, worldly-wise. Not in my experience. They just seem to accept these things completely without question. And I sort of find that quite touching, actually. Anyway, the first story, there's a farmer at Bayagan, right, which is actually the village where my daughter-in-law came from Mindanao. And apparently one night he was putting some animals in the barn, and he left the barn, I think he was presumably making his way home. And he walked into something, and took the window in and did. The weird thing was, though, that he couldn't actually see what he walked into. It was invisible. So he sort of stepped back, and he saw this shimmering thing in front of him. And he looked up, it was about 12 foot in height. Slowly his eyes sort of accommodated it. He saw it was a capri. A capri is a bizarre animal. Very, very tall. There are different capris. I mean, Richie Freeman, he knows of a capri, which is basically sort of a hairy hominid type creature. But the Filipinos that I spoke to, their capri has a human body, but it has a head like a horse. And that is different in other parts of the Philippines. So there's sort of this, you know, cross-cultural mixing and matching at times, which make it very difficult to tie these things down. Anyway, he sees this 12-foot tall, shimmering guy in front of him, right, with a horse-like head. And his arms, which is outstretched, sort of crucifix style. And the head did something weird. He said he got the impression that it was making a sort of a mock gesture, sort of, thou shalt not pass. Which was sort of a bit futile, because he's like down here and he couldn't stop it with his arms up here anyway. But this guy didn't want to go past this creature because by tradition you have to ask their permission. And you have to call them parai, which means roughly friend. And if you do that, they're okay, because they're not aggressive creatures by nature. They're quite very friendly. But apparently, it looked down at him, cigar between its teeth, and it just sort of went, oh, 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 oh. Sort of like Johnny Green Giant style. And so he called it, you know, parai friend, and he says, look, do you mind if I pass? I need to go home and see my friends and my family. So I'd stood to one side and let him pass. But that's the sort of typical story that you find attached to the capri. This bizarre creature, which many people would say, well, that's just crazy, that can't exist. So many people have seen it. Now, there is in Bayagan a road called Tulay Road. Tulay roughly translates as bridge. This is a rather old, battered photograph. Can't really see very much. Just looks like you can see smudged hills and trees and stuff in the background. But if you look at this cartoonized version, you can sort of see the colours sort of come out a bit. And then, just bear with me, if you superimpose the two, you get this. And you can see at the bottom of the picture there's a red line. That represents Tulay Road. And it's a long road. It stretches from Baragan to the other end is this rather incongruous building which belongs to the National Irrigation Association or something. But in between there's sort of like just long stretches where there's nothing, and then there's a few cottages, and on the right there's like a basketball court. And there's a mango tree, or there was a mango tree on Tulay Road where the local capri lived. And everyone in the village sort of knew about this creature, and they showed it respect. As I say, capris are not going to be aggressive, although there are a couple of things which are coming later that do make them incredibly angry. And one evening, some students who had some sort of like high school reunion or something were walking along Tulay Road, and were making a bit too much noise. And all of a sudden, the capri jumps out in front of him. And he has his cigar, he inhales, he blows the smoke, and there's this plume of smoke that clouds these sort of youngsters. This heavy sort of rasping noise comes from him, right? Rather intimidating. And they're all just around him, terrified. And my daughter-in-law's father, who was alive at the time, he came out of his house. And I think he was some sort of like village elder or something, and he said, so what's going on? So they told him the story, and he sort of chided them and said, well, you know, in future just be quiet when you pass there, you know, at this time of night, you know, just show some respect. The other thing I forgot to mention was that the Capri had gently clipped this mule around the ear, right? It was making some noise, you know, which I thought was quite quaint. And so, this creature, if you leave it alone, it's fine. But if you invade its territory and you upset it or disturb it in any way, then unfortunately it will get quite angry. I mean, one of the worries I'm giving this talk is that sort of the health police are going to say it. I mean, just imagine a conversation, you know, between sort of Gavin and Stacey, and it's sort of like, oh, there's this cripple in the Philippines that smokes cigars. Really bring out the nicotine patches, you know. I mean, you can imagine a Capri with the nicotine patches, just it ruins the atmosphere slightly. So I came with this little ditty. If you're caught short, you need a pee, then feel free to pee on a mango tree. But before you let rip and say a tulip pip, always ask permission from the resident Capri. The reason for this, astonishingly, the Capri doesn't want you to knock its house down, doesn't want you to chop the tree down. It doesn't mind if you urinate against it. You just have to ask permission, which is odd. There's no problem with that. So to get along fine with the Capri, you have to really work out the ground rules. And some people have actually formed relationships with these bizarre creatures on a quite sort of astonishing level. My daughter-in-law's mother was asked to recruit by a friend who lived in Manila, some people that go to Manila and work as sort of housekeepers. So she got a few people from the village, and one of them, a friend of my daughter-in-law's, had actually struck up a relationship with this Capri. So she went to him and said, look, you know, sorry about this, but I'm off to Manila to do some work in the Capri. It's no problem. You maybe I can tag along. He said, oh, it's a really nice area down there where I can live, and I'm happy to come with you. And she said, yeah, that's cool. So the Capri went with him. Whether I had actually booked a seat on the plane or anything for him, I'm not quite sure. Whether they just tagged along invisibly. I think that's probably the more likely option. But anyway, the Capri went with this girl to Manila. Then I lived in a mango tree there, and then she got married and moved off, and I don't know what happened to the Capri. But while it was away from the town, somebody built some houses, and they cut down the mango tree and built these houses, so it was unable to go back to its previous residence. And I think now this upset a few people, I think, and now they have this sort of rule that you can't build houses on two-man road. So this story, as you gather, is now going into the realms of the surreal. Not only have a cryptid, like an elemental or whatever you want to call it, but it's one that will actually tag along when you go away. Absolutely bizarre. But having spoke to so many Filipinos about these experiences, you know, I've got no reason to disbelieve them. Something very strange going on here. But you'll see why this thing about the Capri relocating with its human friend, you know, from Mindanao up to Manila, it has some significance, which we'll come on to later. So, my son gave me this telephone number, and I rang this guy, who's a very professional person. What I'm going to show you now, this is the site, I think, where the mango tree was. There's some young Filipino children. That is Betty Daladar, right? That's my daughter-in-law's mum, who took this group to Manila and the Capri, apparently. And there's the mango tree. Someone Click that, isn't it? Yeah, that's Josie and Simon. For the record, that's Josie on the left. And so I spoke to her, I got some really good background information on this strange creature. And this picture is of Josie's grandfather, who was a village elder. So extraordinary stories attached to this guy and his sort of spiritual abilities. He was a really fantastic guy. I've never met him. I wish I had the privilege. And unfortunately, he passed away in his late 90s not too long ago. Bear with me. Okay. So where does Cornwall come in then? Well, the telephone number that my son gave me was of this Filipino guy who was a very highly intelligent, very educated person. And he openly admitted to me that he'd seen the Capri. And he said he didn't want his name mentioned, for professional reasons. He was worried about, what sort of backlash this would cause. But he was happy to tell me his experience. And his experience was this. He brought his family on holiday to England. So you can imagine, right? Filipino mum and dad, 2 kids. They decided to spend some time in Cornwall, so they booked into this quite nice hotel. And one evening, this guy and his wife decided to take a stroll outside of the hotel. In front of the hotel there is a patio, and surrounding the patio there is a wall made from concrete blocks, but sort of quite ornate and quite, attractive. And he said, we came out of the hotel, walked out the patio, and there it was. There was this Capri just sitting there, just 12 foot tall. And he said it had 1 foot on the ground, the other one was actually balanced on the wall. He said its knee was tucked up under its chin, quite relaxed, cigar in hand, and it just looked at him, and looked away. And he said, I didn't feel frightened in any way. He said, I just startled, but not frightened. So I'm thinking, okay, how does this Filipino cryptid elemental end up in Cornwall? We'll go back to the story about the cryptid that went with this young girl and lived in this tree and followed her all the way from Mindanao to Manila. Maybe, for whatever reason, these creatures are attached to people and they can relocate with them and move with them. This guy had no sort of sense, no awareness that this Capri had followed them all the way from the Philippines. But it seems a reasonable presumption that it must have done so. What was it doing there? Why did it follow them? I don't know. Maybe Capris are said to be very protective towards humans that they befriend. It's not easy to get to know them, but when they do, they get to like you and look after you. So maybe it came with them as some sort of elemental bodyguard or something. I don't know. Quite bizarre. So that was the end of that experience. A 12-foot tall, cigar-smoking Filipino cryptid in Cornwall. I mean, it's like the strangest story I've ever heard. I mean, I've done some strange ones in my time. I did a story on this obscure fruit, which is a sort of lemon-type fruit that only grows in one part of Bangladesh. And it has sort of miraculous properties, allegedly. It's never ever been studied by science. That was a weird story. Weirder again was another story I didn't take, the magic upside down beans in Valencia. Right? I didn't go into that one, right? But that was a really interesting story. This seemed to me to the biscuit. I'd never come across a story of cryptids or elementals travelling in this way at the other side of the planet. Why did this, I mean, it was 12 foot tall. It's not diminutive, right? It's easily spotted. How come nobody else saw it? I don't know. Maybe it was because the guy is Filipino. Maybe there's some sort of cultural, almost psychic bond between Filipinos and the cryptids or elementals. Maybe they can see them when we don't. Which is really bizarre, because you have to wonder how many other cryptids out there are wandering around. But they can be outside in a car park. But we don't see them, because maybe we don't have that cultural affinity with them. How many of ours have have travelled abroad. I think it was Richie made the comment yesterday, which I thought was really interesting, because I was thinking along similar lines. Maybe some of our sort of British Isles conventional cryptids, maybe are in the Philippines, but they don't see them because they don't have that cultural sort of affinity with them. I don't know. I have no explanations, but I would be interested to hear them. So, I often get accused of being sort of slightly naive, believing in things that are just off the scale. Well, there are two reasons for that. The first one is that I don't see any corollary between the bizarreness or the weirdness of an experience and its believability. What you will believe, because it's acceptable to you, is basically down to your cultural understanding and your state of mind. So what one person finds very hard to believe, another person might accept without question. So just because a story is weird, just because a cryptid smokes cigars, doesn't make it any less or more likely to me. Right? I just want to know what's going on. I just want to dig and find out. What I do know is that the capri and other sort of less friendly creatures of its ilk, such as the aswang, right? The aswang is a Filipino cryptid elemental, which is something called the bamboo demon. There's actually a novel written about it some years ago. And you just don't mess with these creatures, right? They are not, I promise you, all sweetness and light. Some of their behaviour patterns may seem quite bizarre and almost fairy tale like those, but I know people who've had negative experiences with the aswang, and certainly not something that I would want to go through. But the capri is different. It's okay, as long as you show a bit of respect. You call it friend, or sometimes they'll call them amigo. If they say capri, they'll say amigo. The capri will quite happily let them pass. Just demand a little bit of civility. So how do you know then if you've upset a capri? Well, apparently, if you wake up one morning and you find that your dwelling, your house, is surrounded by ash, you know A, that the capri has been nearby, and B, that you've upset it. I presume this ash must have dropped from its cigar, right? That's probably the legend behind the story. How true that is, I don't know. Even that sort of makes you stand back and contemplate cautiously a little bit. But I do genuinely believe that the capri in some sense exists. Too many people that I've spoken to, and I have absolutely no reason to disbelieve them, have had these really bizarre experiences with this creature. So, this led me to try and come to some conclusions. It exists, it can travel incredibly long distances, seemingly attached to a Filipino person. As I say, that's maybe because it has some cultural identity with it. But the bizarreness, as I said earlier, doesn't make it less believable. I mean, the fact that the capri wears clothes, which apparently give it its invisibility, smokes cigars, it takes it out of the arena of conventional cryptozoology, and I'll be the first to admit that. Cocker spaniels don't wear suits, for instance. Ferrets don't smoke cigars. Winston Churchill, between their little pointy teeth. Do they exist? Yes. As I said, in some senses they do. So I'll sort of like to, before I go into any questions, finish with another little ditty. If you should decide to journey afar to the land of the Filipino capri, then take with you a king-sized Havana cigar. Be courteous if you should pee. The capri likes quiet and a sedatory smoke. If you get on his good side, you find he's a really nice bloke. So that's the talk. Now for the questions. Anybody got any? Roland?
Yes, I have no microphone and nobody can hear my little voice.
I think one's coming.
is it switched on?
While Roland's composing himself, I just want to show you that is an artistic representation of the Capri outside of the hotel in Cornwall, which may or may not be an exact likeness. Probably not. Roland.
With regard to the Capri travelling, the same thing is said of kind of tutelary spirits attached to families or households in other cultures as well. For example, the Scottish brownie has been, according to legend, able to travel to Spain with the laird of whatever house he's supposed to do the cleaning up in. In New Zealand, they see occasionally visions of what are quite European sort of little people. It's as though these kind of spirits, or whatever they are, even if they're sort of psychic projections, do tend to follow certain families and certain households. They're attached to them.
That's interesting, because one thing I didn't mention during the talk, because it wasn't directly relevant, is that John Triplow and I are writing a book at the moment about quite notorious elemental, a brag, in Tyneside, and it has a horrendous reputation. But the brag seems to focus on families, and there's one instance that was sort of researched for the book where an individual family, an entire family, immediate and distant, every single person had an experience with this brag, and not very pleasant, but others didn't. It seemed to be family orientated almost, bizarre sort of way, so maybe there's some sort of cultural connection there.
Yes, I'm a little chary of the term cultural, because that indicates it wouldn't happen to another family. I think they're more attached to the household itself. And I mean, it's the old story of the hog that plagues the life out of the family it's attached itself to, and when they move, they find the hog is in the back of the cart with them. It's an old one, and it's very widespread. I'm more inclined to think the attachment is to the family rather than to the place or to the area.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, as I say, this particular case that I've got in mind in this book that we're writing, the brag certainly attaches itself to a family or a household, you know, because everyone in the household, you know, immediate and distant, had experiences, but people outside it didn't, you know, so there was definitely something going on there, this familiar attachment.
And as for people thinking you naive, just because something is outside, is unfashionable scientifically, it doesn't mean it isn't true.
Well, that's quite correct. I mean, I was saying to John this morning before we came down here, I said I actually quite enjoy sort of talking about outer edge cryptids, you know, I mean,
yes.
Partly because I find them interesting, but partly because I know that it sort of stretches the imaginations of some people, right? They find it very hard to cope with, but I actually sort of get a perverse little kick out of that, actually, making people struggle with what I talk about because it's so odd. But I do find them very, very interesting.
Yes, I'd heard of the Capri before and the cigar. I'm a bit dubious about the cigar, because where did they come from? Are they growing sort of tobacco in secret fields in the Philippines? Or is it something that looks like a cigar, but in fact is something else?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think 100 years ago they probably did grow them into a secret field, but now they probably bulk buy them off eBay or something.
They may try to break the American blockade and buy them from Havana, I should say.
Any other questions? Yeah, I think that's... is that... Yeah, sorry, I can't really see you.
Yeah, Anna.
I know who you are.
Yeah, I thought actually what Rowan would have immediately said would have been the most well-known spirit for travelling, which is the Banshee. Because the Banshee fits exactly, because the Banshee traditionally is attached to certain families. You're only supposed to have a Banshee if you want to descend from one of the royal families of Ireland. But Banshee sightings have been recorded wherever the families have gone, in Scotland, in Australia, New Zealand, and the Banshee has been heard and seen by people who are not Irish. So it's out of the culture. People are seeing that. But I mean, another thing, I personally know of a case in Leeds where somebody encountered Baron Sandy in, of all things, a Morrison's supermarket. And without going into this too much detail, it's actually her husband. She was born over here, she's a West Indian, of West Indian descent. But she didn't recognise and didn't know who it was. But her husband did, because her husband had done something to upset her time. So you can, it's in big trouble.
Yeah, thanks for that. One more question? Yeah, is that Richard?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh.
Is there any information in the law of any of the people who see these kinds of apparitions, perhaps, about how they come into existence? Possibly even how they can be banished?
From what I've gathered from the Philippines I've told you, right, it's not the sort of thing that actually needs to be banished, right, because it's actually not unsociable. It's just leave it alone and it will leave you alone, you know what I mean? You just sort of by default step back from it, don't interact with it too much, and upset it, it'll be fine, you know. But in terms of how it came into existence, I really don't know. That's an interesting question, actually. Thanks for that. The gentleman behind there?
Two things. Well, one, I'm interested in the etymology of the name. It makes me think of kapra out of goat, but it's not a goat line.
Right. Well, this is where you've hit on something.
Is it Tagalog?
Well, you've got to bear in mind that in the Philippines there are over 100 languages spoken. And they're not sort of variations on the theme, some are radically different. And you just can't understand the person who speaks the dialogue, maybe even in the next town. So the names that change, you know, I mean, what Richard understands as a Capri is something different to what I discovered. Maybe the people I was talking to came from a different part of the Philippines, maybe the next village down the road. So there is a linguistic problem there, do you know what I mean? You just have to run with what you're given by the people who lived in that particular area.
The other thing I was interested in the horse, I presume it goes back to the arrival of the Spanish.
Well, the guy I spoke to, I said, was it a horse's head or a horse-like head? And he said, well, it has like a long snout. He said, it looks like a horse's head, right? But it's not actually literally the head of a horse, you know? That's the nearest approximation.
I was wondering about the possible presence of horse-headed goblins in Roman, the Spanish culture. I mean, it looks like Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the ass's head.
Yes. I just think that, you know, the problem is there's been that much cross-cultural contamination now, you know what I mean? And it's impossible, I think, something to get back to the pure source or something, or the true root of it. But,
tobacco as well, was originally from the Americas. So
well, yeah.
The cigar is an alien element.
So, you know, where these things attach themselves to the story, I really don't know, you know, but they're there, and it is in its own sort of state of evolution now at a certain point. As I say, I hope they don't evolve into nicotine patches, you know, and get rid of the cigar. I would ruin the atmos. But yeah, it's the fact that they're so bizarre. I don't like rolling that doesn't mean they don't exist. You know what I mean? We just have to understand, I think, in a deeply different way.
The puka is a creature that can have a variety of shapes, but it actually doesn't have a horse's head. It has generally a donkey's body, and if you happen to get on the back of the donkey, it will ride around furiously, but it won't do you much harm apart from that. You'll have saddles for us next day.
Well, they are like the brags in the northeast of England. They will masquerade as a horse, and you get on it, will throw you off into a briar patch or something. Do you know what I mean? It's very similar. Well, look, I appreciate your questions. Thank you very much. I think it's a time.
Okay, Mike, one lady in the back.
Sorry.
Dawn at the back. Hang on, Dawn. Wait for the microphone.
Hi, Mike. Is anybody trying photographing anything within this room?
Not to my knowledge, and I think for two reasons. Well, no, three actually. We'll start with the least likely one first. I mean, I part of my business, I do photo restoration, and in the Philippines, because of the climate, photos have a very short shelf life. They tend to delaminate very quickly. So even if any were taken and they weren't looked after properly and kept in the right conditions, you know, after a few years there'd be nothing left of it. Then there's the other aspect is that you until relatively recently in the Philippines, cameras were not as common as they were in this country, so I think that reduced the likelihood of the photograph being taken. I think the main reason is that because Filipinos by tradition, if you ever get to know them, right, that once you get inside the Filipino mindset, They're an amazing bunch of people. They're just the most likeable people I've ever met. You know, but they do have a big thing about respect. They don't like to show disrespect for these things. So maybe in their mind there may be a thing about, well, I don't want to disrespect by taking a photograph, and we won't be happy with that. So I think that maybe you'll be reluctant to take a photograph in the first instance. You know, I would love it if somebody said, look, I've got a photograph of a Capri, bring it on, send me it. You know what I mean? I'd love to see it. But sadly, to my knowledge, that sort of other crude illustration is about the best thing you can get.
Thank you, Mike.
All right,
I'm sorry, Mike, I do apologise if you've come to do it already. But one of the things I always find interesting about Filipino fortean is the parallels with one of my favourite subjects, which is Puerto Rico fortean. Because again, you've got both classical Spanish culture and American imperial culture overlaid upon the native culture, and the sort of synergy that the three totally different cultures have when they interact with each other, particularly the interaction between the fairly bloodthirsty Roman Catholicism of the Spanish and the animism of the native peoples. I find that fascinating.
One of the things I found was that, as I was doing research, I mean, a lot of Filipinos are Catholic, depending on the area of the Philippines they live in, and yet they see no contradiction between being devoutly Roman Catholic, but also accepting the existence of these rather bizarre entities. You know what I mean? To them, they're just another part of this weird, wonderful world in which we live. But John mentioned the overlay of cultures. I mean, one of the things I think I mentioned before was that if you meet a Capri, one very simple way to get on its rights, I used to address it as amigo, you know, which is a Spanish, you know, not an indigenous Filipino term, you know. So yeah, there has been these cultural overlays that are sort of woven into the West and the warp of Capri sort of folklore, you know, and John's right, they are absolutely fascinating.
I always hate bringing talks to a close like this, but I've got some particularly peculiar news for you. In fact, I've got two pieces of peculiar news. The second piece is much more momentous, but the first piece, which is momentous in its own way, this is the first time in 11 weird weekends that we're running to schedule. We're not late. I am really that is fantastic. Okay, the second piece of news is that Richard, and I'm not being silly now, Richard Freeman's talk on the Japanese monsters this afternoon is either cancelled or very much truncated, because this afternoon we have made a cryptozoological breakthrough. And furthermore, a cryptozoological breakthrough which is unarguable and unimpeachable. Richard and I have just been up there seeing it, and it is something pretty amazing. I first met Mike Hallowell maybe about 12 years ago when I was working on a long-defunct and not very fondly remembered magazine called Quest that I was the editor for. And what I didn't know was, although I was the editor, the person who owned it, the person who paid all the bills, was a complete shyster. And I ended up making friends with all these writers around the world, and then finding that the editor who paid the bills wasn't going to pay their bills. And he ended up going bankrupt with about 25,000 quid worth of unpaid authors. So the following year, when Richard and I decided we were going to start something called the Weird Weekend, we thought, well, where's that bloke from Newcastle? I think we really owe him something, because we left him 3,000 quid in the red, even though it wasn't our fault. So we phoned him up, and he was, I think, the second speaker at the very first Weird Weekend, and he's been a good friend ever since. Mike Hallowell.